ado, it's a real pleasure to be here at St. Paul's University. As mentioned, I've been to two out of the three universities, but given the fact that St. Paul's is so intimately tied with Ottawa U, I consider myself alumni of this university as well. I've been asked to speak to you about several topics, and one that could easily fill several hours. Briefly, I'd like to tell you a bit about what I do and how it promotes better governance. Then I'll show you how oversight is needed in areas like policing and local government. And of course, I'll leave time for your questions in both official languages. Now, let's start with the basics. What is an ombudsman? Now, it may sound like something you buy at IKEA. And if it does, you're not too far off because it is Swedish. And I'm often asked, especially in university circles and academia, why do you still call yourself an ombudsman in 2014? Why not an ombudsperson or an ombuds or some other derivative? And the simple answer is that the man in ombudsman does not mean man. It's a gender-neutral word. It means a person who takes complaints. Now, I take complaints, I take a lot of them, regarding the provincial government. And we have a team of experienced professional investigators who get to the bottom of everything, small issues like driver's licenses, to bigger issues such as the messed up billing at Hydro One. And my job as ombudsman is to hold the government to account and to champion the public interest. In many ways, my job is to humanize government, make government understand the implications of their decisions. It's easy when you're in a glass tower on Bay Street, downtown Toronto, to make decisions in a very sanitized environment, not realizing that they actually affect people, not always in a positive way. Now, there's nothing new in the ombudsman model. We didn't invent it. It's something that comes straight from Sweden, from 1809. The first ombudsman's name was, does anybody know? Don't start Googling. Lars Mannerheim. And if we look at the different ombudsman statutes across Canada, and all the provinces do have an ombudsman with the exception of Prince Edward Island, they are all based loosely on the Swedish parliamentary ombudsman. It really is remarkable. And there are ombudsmen all over the world. South Africa is called the public defender. In Quebec, la protectrice du citoyen. In Iowa, Citizens Aid. These are all classical ombudsmen, all derivatives from the Swedish parliamentary ombudsman's model. The US has a few states that have ombudsmen, such as Iowa, Hawaii, Arizona. So there was a huge wave in the late 70s, early 70s, and throughout the 60s where these offices were being created. And there was a tremendous amount of momentum. And the wave swept through Canada, started sweeping through the US, then stopped. Federally, there was a bill introduced in 1979 by Pierre Elliott Trudeau to create a federal ombudsman. It had a first reading. Then, for those old enough to remember, there was an election, a minority government was elected, and the ombudsman was never reintroduced. Instead of a centralized ombudsman, what we saw emerge federally was specialty ombudsmen such as the Information Commissioner and Auditor General and so on. And the reason why the ombudsman did not spread through to the federal government at the time is because of Ontario's first ombudsman, 1975, Arthur Maloney. Arthur Maloney was a good friend of Bill Davis, who was the premier at the time. And Bill Davis thought he'd put one of his friends there. And Arthur Maloney was very qualified. He was one of the top defense lawyers in Canada. I mean, I still have people coming up to me talking about his jury trials and so on. So he's very capable, but a friend of Bill Davis. So he put his friend there and said, he'll cut me some slack. And he turned out to be a ferocious watchdog. Ferocious to the point where the folks in Ottawa were starting to pay notice and saying, uh-oh, do we really want this in Ottawa? And so the storyline is that he frightened the federal government into not creating an ombudsman's office. So I came along in 2005, but beside Arthur Maloney, I looked like a pussycat. We will be celebrating our 40th anniversary next year and marking my 10th year on the job, April 1st. Now, citizens today are more informed, connected, and sophisticated in their expectations of public officials than ever before. The public knows more about government and demands more about government than before. This is an age of consumer empowerment, thanks to technology. And that applies to all of us as consumer of government as well. We expect government to work for us, and we want someone to be held accountable when it doesn't. Now, I know some of you may be public servants. I consider myself a public servant. Whatever level of government or part of the broader public service you may work in, we all know that sometimes things go wrong. And that's where my office comes in. We receive thousands of complaints per year. In fact, since I've been ombudsman, we've taken 144,000 complaints. This past year, we received 27,000 complaints, the most our office has received in 40 years. What does 27,000 complaints annually tell you? Well, on the negative side, there's no doubt that it tells you that there are a lot of people unhappy with the provincial government. But on the positive side, it means that more people than ever are being helped by our office. And in the neutral territory, you have the simple fact that when you consider the pervasive role of the provincial government in the lives of 13 million Ontarians, complaints are bound to happen. You'll see throughout my presentation some of the illustrations from my office's annual reports, which we bring life, or which we use to bring life to the frustrations of people with the government. Just think of all the things that the government does that affects you. It determines how much we pay for power and who can sell it to us. It is responsible for hospitals, health care, how drugs are funded. It has the enormous job of administrating child support claims for millions of separated and divorced parents. And of course, it literally runs the lives of those who are held in our jails. Those two last groups, inmates and those who rely on the Family Responsibility Office, are two top sources of complaints. Most complaints can be resolved if they deal with minor misunderstandings and can be resolved rather quickly. But some are the result of deep-rooted, systemic, ethical failure. If you work in government, I'm sure you know that government and its agencies rarely like to say, "We made a mistake," or "Boy, did we have a bad idea here." Your director isn't likely to start a meeting with, you know what? I think we've lost sight of the public interest. What we need is a culture change. But that can and does happen after an investigation by my office. And why is that? Because our investigations dig hundreds or even thousands of complaints and get to the underlying issues. We deliver solid, factual analysis of problems, and we draft constructive recommendations for change. These are some of the examples of reports we've issued since 2005. You might not realize it, but chances are every single person in this room has been affected by our reports. So I can bring you through some of the covers here quite fast. The right to be impatient is about outdated screening of newborns, where the World Health Organization was recommending 29 tests at birth, and Ontario was only testing for 2 diseases, causing the deaths of 50 babies a year in Ontario. Countless coroner's inquests had recommended the upgrading of testing. The government had balked at it, and it took one of our reports called The Right to be Impatient to get the government moving on those recommendations. The state of California was testing for 92 diseases at birth. Ontario, 2. When we visited the lab of the company that was responsible for making that technology, guess where we found that lab located? In Toronto. We were exporting the technology to Mexico. Your baby would be better off born in a developing country than in Canada. That's where you could find Canadian technology. If you've ever bought a lottery ticket, a game of trust, you will realize now that when you buy a lottery ticket, you have to sign the front of it, not the back. We did an investigation that uncovered extensive fraud in the lottery system, where retailers were cashing in on the winnings of vulnerable people to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. The government was aware that this was happening, but the Lottery Corporation had a cozy relationship with the retailers, and because of that, ignored the ongoing problem. And the list goes on. If I can pick the code, for example, which is one of our latest investigation into prisoners being abused by prison guards. Yes, exactly, Jean-Paul Léon, covering their tracks. So the list goes on. Police oversight. This is the coverage of first-line cancer treatment called Avastin. We call the report a vast injustice. So it's safe to say that all of this work that we've done has likely touched the lives of everyone in Ontario in the last 10 years. It's hard to believe that time has flown by so fast. I look like my 16-year-old kid Hugo in 1996. What the heck happened to me? It's like one of those Obama pictures, you know? You see the first picture, he looks all sweet and black hair, curly hair. You look at him now, he's all silver. These are pictures of various milestones in my career. When I started as military ombudsman in '98, I started as the Ontario Ombudsman in 2005. And you know what? This job as the Ontario Ombudsman in 2005 meant that I was tackling a lot of very difficult issues and not always making me very popular with the government, of course. When I was finally renewed, I was invited to come to the vote because I'm appointed by vote of the Legislative Assembly. So I made sure to show up in the public gallery to watch the vote, and I brought all my friends with me. Now, I'm very passionate about my job as helping the little guy navigate the stormy seas of bureaucracy. The fact is, ordinary people do not have the money, the time, or expertise to fight back against government. But my staff and I do. The role of the government is to help people and not harm them. Sometimes people in government don't foresee the effects their policies will have on real people. I'm there to remind them of this and fix problems where I can. Let's face it, whether you are an organization, an individual, you will probably work better if there's a chance that your work will be given public examination. The famous line by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis is that, quote, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant." We have our own Canadian version of that quote from former Chief Justice Brian Dixon, who said that the Ombudsman's role is, quote, "to shine light in dark places." But I want to stress to you that all these years of disinfecting dark places have not turned me cynical. Yes, I've seen lots of problems and shortfalls in government, but I am still an optimistic. I know government can do better. I have seen it happen. When people complain about government performance, what they're really saying is not that bad service and bad administration are not normal or not acceptable. We have had public servants and senior government officials thank our office for alerting them to problems and helping them improve their work. All of this reminds us that good government is possible because it is made up of people. So what do we mean when we talk about good government? Is there such thing as ethics in government? I think so, and more importantly, the people of Ontario believe this. They expect government to be honest and efficient, and they are willing to pay for independent officers of the legislature, like me, to help it make so. This is an important point. I mentioned it before. I am an officer of the Legislative Assembly. I'm not a government appointee. These are some of my colleagues, officers of Parliament. And together we work to uphold the public interest and hold the government to account. Now, you saw from the number of people in the public gallery cheering me on my reappointment, this is not always a very popular job. In fact, I've said it before, I'm like a skunk at a garden party. But if I'm doing my job right, I shouldn't be the most popular guy at Queen's Park, right? As long as the government is accepting my recommendations and we're credible and we're working hard at fixing problems affecting thousands of people, I really don't care whose gala list I'm on. It's always encouraging to see people like you who study ethics and consider the values affecting your actions in government or any work you do, especially if you deal with the public. All of us who work in government know how easy it is to fall into rigid routines based on regulations and bureaucratic practices and strictures. We have the Ebola virus. I call this the Rulitis virus, and it's highly contagious. The default answer to everything is to stick to rules, even if they defy common sense. But are you really putting public interest first, ethics first? You need to ask yourselves the question, what's the right thing to do? Not to become guilty of the slavish adherence to rules at the expense of common sense. That's where values come into play. Ethical government means treating people as well, people, not just numbers. Government organizations, no matter how large and powerful they are, must act in the public interest and protect the most vulnerable in society. And ensuring the government meets those expectations is part of my role as Ombudsman. When I see a problem, I say to myself, how can we fix it? And the wonderful thing about the Ombudsman model and the Ontario Ombudsman Act, which governs my office, is that it is so flexible. We have all types of tools at our disposal, just like a Swiss Army knife. We have none of the rigid processes and outrageous costs, like, for example, going to court. We avoid the partisan pitfalls of politics. We have strong tools of investigation and a whole range of tools of persuasion, from the softest diplomatic encouragement to the bullhorn of using the media. Not only does this allow us to get rid of rulitis, it also keeps the work we do endlessly interesting. Speaking of strong tools and how to use them, I was invited to speak a bit about the kind of oversight that applies to the most powerful agency in our society, the police. Public ethics and policing is an issue that I've tackled in one way or another through most of my career. The police occupy a very special place in society, and rightly so. They are the men and women we trust to protect us and keep our communities and families safe. We give them guns and badges and the power to make arrests, but with that power comes great responsibility and an obligation to make sure they live up to the spirit, the laws they are there to enforce. When the government makes a mistake, it's not a case of late government check or poor customer service. It can literally be a matter of life and death. In the worst case scenario, when police are involved in the death or serious injury of a civilian, Ontario has the Special Investigations Unit, the fully civilian oversight body in Canada, which I led from 1996 to 1998. But unfortunately, ever since it was created some 20 years ago, the SIU has had to fight on two fronts. The police at times think that they're anti-police and don't take it seriously enough, and the public think the SIU is too pro-police. My office has done 2 investigations into these long-standing issues that go to the heart of the tensions that exist between the police, their civilian overseers, and the government that is ultimately responsible for both. Our first investigation looked into how the SIU was too soft on the police, had too many former police officers working for us, and generally had a pro-police bias. I found that the SIU was a toothless tiger, plagued by a culture of complacency and secrecy. Families were being kept in the dark about why so few charges were laid against the officers. The underlying problem was not just the way the SIU was run, but went right through to the legislation which was set up for it to work. That legislation was done through a hastily drafted amendment to the Police Services Act, and to this day it is not clear which incidents must be reported to the SIU, nor are there consequences for the police service that fails to cooperate when the SIU, when it is required to do so. I recommended new legislation to clarify the scope of the SIU's work and bring in consequences when the police don't cooperate, because as we speak now, there are none. I urge the SIU to include more civilian investigators as opposed to all police, and to discontinue the practice, which I thought was unbelievable when we did our investigation, discontinue the practice of having ex-police officers on the SIU walking around with police paraphernalia like rings or ties from their former police forces. Now think about that for a moment. You've got a relative, family member shot dead by the police. You're told that there's an independent civilian body like the SIU made up of civilians coming in to investigate it. You're told to have confidence in the investigation. The civilian members show up with police ties and rings and other sordid paraphernalia from the police service they used to belong. How much confidence would you have in the impartiality of that investigator? Would you ever imagine showing in court one day and the judge is gowned and you're the accused, and the judge has a crown attorney pin on his gown? How would you feel to be judged by that person? Conversely, you're a crown attorney prosecuting a serious crime, and the defense and the judge shows up with a pin of the Defense Association on his gown. But somehow at SIU, no one thought that this was abnormal. In fact, even after I made this finding, I kept getting nasty emails and tweets and so on from police officers saying, hey, what's your problem? We don't see an issue here. He or she is proud of their ex-police service, and they're displaying how proud they are. So it's just something that was beyond the twilight zone to me. And in fact, we recommended that the SIU rid itself of these ties and rings and so on while they were on duty. And the SIU did that. And interestingly enough, about a year later, there was a documentary done in Toronto by a French camera crew that were comparing the SIU to what they have in France, which is nothing. And they were amazed by the SIU, and they were in one of the labs taking footage of an SIU forensic investigator who was disassembling a weapon or something, do whatever they do in those labs. And I was watching the documentary because I gave an interview, and the documentary maker sent me the piece that ran on national French TV. And I was watching it as I was working in my office. It was playing in the background, and then they said, here we are in the SIU's forensic laboratory. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. Let's have a look. So I looked at it. And this SIU investigator who was with the weapon and working on it or whatever, I noticed that one of the fingers had a blur on it. And I'm like, why did they blur out one of the fingers? So I called the documentary and I said, what was that? He goes, oh, he had a police ring. He didn't want us to show it on TV. This is after my report. This is after the SIU decided to order its investigators not to wear police rings and paraphernalia. Like, can you imagine? Of course, this individual never thought that I'd be watching French TV, but I saw it from my office. I couldn't believe it, and I phoned the director of the SIU. I said, what's going on here? I mean, to be so stubborn as to continue doing it, and then to ask the reporter to blur the ring so that somehow I would never find out. So, I think my next recommendation to the SIU should be that they should install metal detectors at the entrance of the building. Catch those rings before they go in the office. So after our first report, I was happy to see that the SIU, the government appointed a new SIU director, and he was really challenged to change the inside culture of the SIU, and he laid more charges, and he wrote over 200 letters to police chief during his term, letting them know every time a police officer did not cooperate, breached the scene, over 200 letters. And you'd be amazed to know that virtually none of them were answered. Now, at the time, the government, because when we issue these reports, it's like a tsunami, right? It's just like front page of all the papers and so on. So there's a lot of pressure on government to react to these reports. So they'll often say, boilerplate lines like, thank the Ombudsman for his hard work, we support the office, we're going to be implementing the recommendations, or we're very favorably looking upon the recommendations. And then you think that, it's all great, but we monitor these all the time. And we came back and did a second investigation of the SIU, this time not focused on the SIU itself, but on the Ministry of the Attorney General, to which the SIU reports. And we wanted to find out why the more broader legislative reforms were not brought about after our SIU investigation. And we found the answer in one of the emails between two officials at the Ministry of the Attorney General. As you know, the decision was made at the time of the Ombudsman's report release that largely due to vehement police opposition, we will not be considering the recommended legislative changes in the near future. Now, that wasn't said publicly, but that was what was exchanged between public servants at the Ministry of the Attorney General, and that found itself in our second report. Another thing we found interesting is the new SIU director had read our report and was bent on bringing those systemic changes at the SIU. And he would publish annual reports, but he'd write them out, send them to be tabled in Parliament, but the government would not table those reports publicly. We found that they were being held up. The government had deemed his reports too provocative. And when you think about it, the SIU is supposed to be the criminal watchdog of the police. Now you got a watchdog that can't bite, and now you got a watchdog that's told don't even bark. The government was censuring its arm's length independent police criminal investigator. Like I said, some of this stuff is beyond Twilight Zone. Meet Douglas Minty and Levi Schaefer. These are two individuals who were shot and killed by the police. And the traditional practice right up until very, very recently was that, this happened in both these cases, is that the police shoot and kill somebody, and then the police unions arrive or notified before the SIU, quite frequently. And guess who shows up at the scene often before the SIU, because they were tipped off before, are the police union lawyers. And they would embark on a practice of representing everybody. Okay, I'm here, here's my card. Okay, all the witness officers, those who witness anything, the shooter, subject officer come forward. And the lawyer would help write the notes of all the officers. Now, the police notes are supposed to be the independent recollection of what police officers saw. But now they're all working on them together, headed off by a lawyer, of all things. Now, it doesn't take much schooling to realize that we have here probably the most egregious conflict of interest you could imagine. You know, if there's a shooting in a bar tonight and you're there, you'll notice one thing. Major crimes unit will come down, swooping. Everybody will be segregated, interviewed separately. Well, why? Because that's how you get the independent recollection of witnesses. The lawyer wasn't there. We've been writing the government all this time to basically read the Riot Act to police union lawyers who were doing this. And we considered that unethical, apart from being completely wrong. And the government at the time punted the issue back to the Law Society. The Law Society issued a practice clarification. So when you're a lawyer, you get rules of practice, you get practice clarifications, which are basically clarifying what's expected of lawyers in the ethical framework. So the Law Society issued an ethical clarification saying, hello, it's not okay for you union lawyers to be representing everybody on scene. It's not okay. You learn that in grade 11 law. Of course, all the police union lawyers screamed to hell, right? They went berserk. So what did the Law Society do? It took back its clarification. So the government won act. The lawyers regulator, the Law Society of Upper Canada, won act. So guess what the families of Doug Minty and Levi Schaefer did? They sold everything they had. They're penniless now. They went to the Superior Court to get a declaratory judgment. In other words, they weren't suing anybody. They just wanted the courts to declare that this is a conflict and it's wrong. They lost at the Superior Court. They appealed to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal ruled that this practice was unethical. But trying to give a bit of a compromise to the police union, they said, well, I guess the police union lawyer can, go there and just set the basic rules, have a minimum role, but he can't help doing the notes. So basically the SIU, it's not even the SIU's case, but Doug Minty and Schaefer's families won, but with a small concession to the police union lawyers. You want to guess what happened next? The police union lawyers appealed. I was shocked when I saw them appeal. I mean, they went right to the Supreme Court of Canada. They were given a concession, I mean, a clear conflict of interest, like I've never seen before. Government refuses to act. Law Society abdicates its duty to regulate lawyers. The Court of Appeal recognizes, which I think is obvious to everybody in the room. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but anyone doesn't see a conflict with this issue? So the Supreme Court of Canada, what do? They overturn the Court of Appeal of Ontario and rule 100% in favor of Minty and Schaefer. These are very courageous families. Nobody would listen to them until they mortgaged themselves, sold everything they have. These families are now penniless. And interesting little footnote here that we can open. We often hear about activist courts that take over the role of government, and they should just rule narrowly and so on. And I'm sure that there are instances where that claim has merit. But I can tell you in this case, the courts did the government's dirty work. I don't think anybody could ever tell you there was no conflict here, except those who stood to profit from this practice, which were the police union lawyers at the time. So there you go. Police notes can be vetted by lawyers. Now, who would ever claim, an objective observer could ever say, oh no, it's okay that the police notes be vetted by lawyers, the lawyers know best. I actually watched the submissions of all parties in the Supreme Court of Canada, and I watched it because it was on CPAC, and I remember, and I was astounded because one of the leading criminal defense lawyers in Canada was representing the police unions, and he was saying, well, Your Honor, it's, the lawyers has a really important role in improving those notes. They don't necessarily do them first, but they're improving the quality of the notes. Well, that's exactly what's wrong with the role of the lawyers. The notes don't make sense. Well, they're the police officer's notes. Take them as they are. So here they are. We won. They tweeted that. So who says that you can't fight City Hall? Now, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the role of our investigation in the G20. The world leaders were gathering for the summit. Tight security was expected. What wasn't expected is that the Toronto police would round up and detain people for simply being outside the fence. There was kind of this thing that was going through police circles of the 5-meter rule, that if you're within 5 meters of the fence and you're asked to identify yourself, and you didn't, you could be arrested. And it became known as the 5-meter rule, which was completely bogus. There was no such thing as a 5-meter rule. But what the government had done, the provincial government, is that it had reenacted a 1939 legislation called the Public Works Protection Act. Now, I was going to say you might remember, but unless you were around in 1939, I certainly wasn't. But the 1939 Public Works Protection Act was to allow the government to arbitrarily detain and arrest citizens who were suspected of helping the Nazis. Now, over the G20 weekend, the government secretly, I said secretly because it was never announced. Now, everybody knows that for a law to be valid, it has to be published somewhere. Well, this one was not published. And it empowered the police under the 1939 Public Works Protection Act to arbitrarily arrest or detain anyone, not just within 5 meters. Now, I would call that a police state. And something happened since 1939. It's called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Hello. 1982. That protects against arbitrary arrest or detention. So why do you think the government didn't publish its regulation, didn't alert the public at least? Hello, we're this weekend, we're bringing back 1939. Why did the government not publicize these new powers which were sought by the Toronto Police and which led to the arrest and detention of thousands of people. Because I would suggest they were concerned that someone might challenge it in the courts and strike it down. This led to thousands of people being arrested or detained. So I released a report, and it was called Caught in the Act, because protesters were caught in the act, the police were caught in the act, provincial government was caught in the act. So I recommended that this provision be abolished and replaced with modern legislation. Now, guess what? It still hasn't been done. The Public Work Protection Act is still in force today. Now, to be fair, we've had minority governments where it's been hard for the government to pass legislation. There have been bills, and then there was an election. And let's hope, though, that the Public Works Protection Act is abolished and very soon, because the Pan Am Games are right around the corner, June 2015. We don't want a repeat of the G20 in Toronto. And I've reminded that to the government, and I will continue to remind them we need to do away with this. Now let's talk about the MUSH sector. MUSH sector is understood to be the broader public service. The broader public service because it's a step beyond the provincial government. Municipalities, universities, school boards, hospital, long-term care. We have been, since 1975, crying out for this sector to be overseen. In fact, the very first Ombudsman of Ontario, Arthur Maloney, the bad boy I was talking about earlier, he was the first one to jump on this issue saying, oops, we missed something in our legislation, it needs to be fixed. The government, just before the election, introduced Bill 179, which proposes to extend our oversight over municipalities, school boards, and universities. We had always said that if the government was going to give us the MUSH sector, we would prefer the other letters first: hospitals, long-term care, children's aid societies. Why do we prefer those letters first? It's because they represent the most vulnerable people in society. I have had 5 out of my 6 children through the university. And trust me, they think they're the most harm done by people in the world. But it doesn't compare to a child protection system, an elderly, and someone who is sick. But the government decided to inverse it and give us the 3 letters first. Maybe they were doing it by order. I don't know. But in any event, right after the election, the government reintroduced the legislation. It's now called Bill 8. And we have been turning away thousands of complaints in these sectors since 2005, and now we're hopeful that we can assist people. Now, to be fair, universities, I don't think they're a big problem. Most of them have university ombudsman. I don't know if we have one here. No, but most of the others do have it. We want to work through the existing mechanisms, and I don't believe that universities will be problematic in terms of oversight. The one big issue, though, is the municipalities, and I'm going to tell you, this is going to be a challenge. There are 444 municipalities in Ontario. I kid you not. I discover new ones every day. The municipality of IMO, I-M-O, who knew that existed? These are remote places that are out there, and interestingly enough, many are dysfunctional. People like to always point to Toronto. Maybe Toronto's a little bit more dysfunctional than others, but there are serious issues in our municipalities. And it's fair to say that many of the incumbent councillors and mayors right now have shown panic and hysteria over Bill 8. Some, as our mayor here in Ottawa, Jim Watson, have said, we don't need Bill 8. Everything is great. And that's why we had this illustration in our annual report. They're acting like the sky's going to fall. Chicken Little. Now, it's important to note that the Bill 8 will not give me any more jurisdiction over municipalities that the province doesn't already have over itself. Think of municipal government. There's an election every 4 years. What do you have in between? Nothing. We've received 9,000 complaints about municipalities since 2005. The only ombudsman you will find in Ontario is in Toronto, because the City of Toronto Act forces Toronto to have one. And even there in Toronto, as soon as she started to release some hard-hitting reports, the mayor, Rob Ford, in case you've never heard of him, led a charge to cut her term from 5 years to 2. So the law says there shall be an ombudsman with a 5-year term, just as I am. But when her term came to renewal, there was a lot of hemming and hawing among council and this back and forth. So they sawed it off and said, oh, we'll give her 2 extra years. That's not the legislation. It's 0 or 5. You can't just make it up as you're going along. But it seems that in Toronto, anything is possible. Now, I could go on about municipalities because since 2008, our office has had a very small sliver of oversight over municipalities. We investigate whether council met secretly to do city business contrary to the law. We have that authority. Under Bill 8, we're going to have everything. We're going to be able to investigate council members, mayors, and city bureaucracy. Now we have a small sliver. And it's been a real eye-opener. You're talking about ethical challenges? Oh my God. In 2007, Senior Superior Court Judge Doug Cunningham investigated, or rather had a public inquiry in Mississauga. And he released a report in 2007, a report to which the province has yet to answer. There's no answer to this report. And this is one of his, it bears the time just to read this quote. It is clear that Mississauga, because this involved conflict of interest allegations against Hazel McCallion, the mayor, who has been mayor there for 60 years or something. She's not running in this election. But it is clear that Mississauga, and indeed all other Ontario municipalities, requires a better ethical infrastructure. Members of the public have the expectation that mayors, other members of council and public officials will conform to ethical standards. It is fundamental that members of the public do not have to depend on the personal ethical standards of elected officials. Can it be clearer? Of course, no answer from the government. And in fact, this was tabled in 2007. Well, a year after this was tabled, a neighboring municipality, Brampton, decided that for expense accounts of council members, that they would not have to be approved by any other authority. Before that, they were approved by the city, budget person. They decided, no, we're going to change the rule. Right now, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go to an honor system. I kid you not. An honor system. Well, I guess they didn't read this quote. We should not have to depend on the personal ethical standards of elected officials. They went to an honor system. I don't know if you've been following the news out of Brampton, but there was an audit recently of the spending of councillors since then. And the mayor was found to have breached spending guidelines 266 times out of 365 days. She's rerunning for election. The last poll, I think, puts her at, about 17%. When the 2008 amendments were done to the Municipal Act, And you know the line, municipalities always say, oh, we are a mature level of government. And they said that with a lot of gravitas, we're a mature level of government. So the government said, okay, you're mature, we're going to make some changes to the statute to allow you to hire your own oversight officers, your accountability officers. How did that work out? Well, like I said, only one ombudsman out of 444 municipalities, and that's the only reason is because they were forced to do so by legislation. So 0. Auditor Generals, that became the flavor of the month. Whoa, that's cool. Let's have an Auditor General in Markham. Let's have one in Sudbury. They were creating it. It became sort of an interesting wave. We stand behind our spending. We're going to have an Auditor General that will clear our name. And then, I kid you not, this is not, you can't make this stuff up. Every time they came out with a negative report, the office was closed down and the person fired. Oshawa gone, Markham gone, Sudbury gone, et cetera, et cetera. It's incredible. So Toronto has an Auditor General. Why? Because it was forced to do so. And interestingly enough, and to the credit of the City of Ottawa, they have the only operating Auditor General's office in all of Ontario. Integrity commissioners, right? Key to operations of government. You have them federally, provincially. You would think municipally, at least an integrity officer to help coach counselors on, can I accept this gift? Is it good for me to go out with these people? I'm being lobbied by these people. All types of ethical considerations. Guess how many integrity commissioners hired since 2008 by municipalities? A paltry 29 out of 444. So people ask me, well, why Bill 8? Well, we're in 2014, 6 years after 2008, when municipalities were the mature level of government, was given the authority to create these offices, and they failed. They failed to rise up to the challenge. Municipalities get $3.8 billion from the provincial government. Plus they collect property taxes. But every dollar sent from the province to the municipality is like a free check. If that same dollar is spent by the province, it's overseen by the Auditor General, Integrity Commissioner, and myself, etc. All these officers of Parliament. But that same dollar is passed on to the municipality, poof, it's gone. Who knows where it lands? Because there is no oversight. And then some people tell me, oh, well, the province, what about the gas plant scandal, They're good ones to talk about the oversight. Well, the gas plant scandal was uncovered by the Auditor General, and I will suggest to you that we would be seeing a lot more scandals in municipalities if they were held to account, which they are not. I talked a little bit about oversight of universities. We oversee currently the Ministry of Training, Universities and Education, and as well, we already have, since 1975, had a role in overseeing public colleges. We had a case called Too Cool for School. Too Cool for School was about a private career college operating illegally. The government knew it was operating illegally, and it went bankrupt suddenly and left a whole bunch of students in the lurch, indebted, nowhere to go. So we recommended the government, get your act together. You have an oversight ability. You oversee these private career colleges. You must take your role seriously. Too Cool for School was followed naturally by Too Cool for School 2, which involved Cambrian College, a public college, and they were actually advertising a course in the health sector, an accredited course, a 3-year program, very elaborate course, costing a pretty penny, which would lead to certification in a certain field and a job in the health sector corresponding to those credentials. Little problem, that those jobs didn't exist. There was like, did not exist. It was fabricated. So imagine you go through the whole university thing, or the whole college thing, you get your accreditation to discover that, hold on, these jobs just do not exist. It's not that there's too much demand, it's just like they don't exist. You made it up. And of course, we recommended to the government that they, again, take up the role of oversight over public colleges more seriously. Now, one of the reasons why we operate a very vocal and high-profile office, and why we maintain a high regular media and social media presence, is that politicians know that they respond fastest when the public is outraged, and the media voice that outrage. We've been known to use colorful language in our reports and at press conferences. I don't have any power to force the government to do anything. So we actually take the lead and publicize our reports. We try to shine that very public light that I've talked about on problems and issues and make our recommendations. Next week is the municipal election. I have been very vocal in pressing candidates, do you support Bill 8? And I've had some pushback saying I should interfere in the provincial election, in the municipal election. I do not support or oppose any candidate. But hey, they keep telling us they're only accountable, they're accountable every 4 years, so this is our chance. And of course, the local politicians cannot effectively control Bill 8 in the sense that it's a provincial piece of legislation, but already they've shown deep-rooted hysteria and panic over Bill 8. And it's important that these candidates indicate whether or not they support greater oversight of municipalities, or do they want to continue with the status quo where they operate in the dark without disinfection, or disinfectant rather. And so next week is time for the election. Make sure you ask your candidate if they support Bill 8. If you're not on social media, or if you are, these are our various addresses. Please follow us for more information. We also have an e-newsletter called The Watchdog. You can subscribe at that address. And I'm happy to take your questions. It is 6:54.
Morals, and human dignity in terms of public policy administration and political administration. And I wrote this question down right at the beginning of your presentation. I noticed that you touched on parts and pieces of ethics, but your comments, is there truly an absence in the political science application and public policy administration in our society today?
Wow. Do I have another hour to answer that? I only deal with the provincial government, so I'm going to limit my answer to them. I think that there is, the root of many of our problems we see in the provincial government is complacency. Now, is complacency called by a lack of ethics, desensitization of government? That I will leave to you and others that are much more qualified than I am to comment on that. But I would put the number one root of problems to complacency. That is not caring. The Lottery Corporation, didn't care about whether fraud was taking place. In fact, in our report, we had intercepted an email between a vice president and the CEO of the lotteries, in which the VP was asking CEO, what are we supposed to do about all these frauds we've been detecting in the system? And the guidance and instruction by the CEO was, this is on our report, quote, sometimes you have to hold your nose. Right? This is in the email from the CEO to the VP. And we reproduced that in our report. Now, does that tell you it's lack of ethics? Is it complacency? Is it simply not caring? That I leave up to you, but I was astounded to see that. And in a lot of the cases, we do complacency towards the enforcement of private career colleges operating illegally, complacency vis-a-vis public colleges' curriculum, complacency, I mean, we've seen this so many times over and over, complacency vis-a-vis police oversight, just not wanting to touch it because we might upset the police. So complacency is the number one thing that we see. On Wednesday, we will be publishing the largest report we've ever published on illegally operating daycares in Ontario. Now, I'm not going to tell you what's in the report, but you might guess what's in that report if you heard carefully the themes that I've talked about tonight. So we'll be publishing that report, and it has, normally we make 3-4 recommendations, 5-6 maybe. This report has more than 100 recommendations. So when you, to follow up, the last point I would make on your question is have a look at the report on Wednesday when it comes out, and that may also help answer your question.
Mr. Marin, I was very interested when you talked about the Law Society of Upper Canada withdrawing its practice clarification because of protests from union lawyers. Am I being naive when that suggests to me that the Law Society is also a toothless tiger?
In this case, it was, definitely. You know, I was discouraged. I remember when they came out with their clarification, I immediately knew that police union lawyers would flip. So I approached Law Society benchers and I said, listen guys, you're on the right track here. Don't back down. Oh, we won't back down, we promise, we promise. But there were literally howls from defense, from police union lawyers. And the main reason I understand they were freaking out, for lack of a better word, was that they were concerned that if the clarification would be maintained, that guess what would happen to their money? It would be pooled. If you have 5 officers involved, you'd have to have 5 lawyers. So A, it'd be more costly to the police union who pay these lawyers, and B, the one lawyer would have his fee divided by 5. So it was all driven by money instead of what is in the public interest. And the Law Society blinked. And the dirty work, the hard lifting had to be done by the courts.
My real interest concerns accountability of oversight bodies.
Yes.
I'm speaking from an actual example that arose within the Department of National Defense. And the question is, what can you do when the oversight authority refuses to act?
Well, that's a good point. People ask me all the time, who oversees you? So before someone asks it, let me answer it. It's that balance between providing incredible independence to an office to do the right thing, and that office can do the wrong thing and hang themselves. And we've seen examples of watchdogs hanging themselves by being lazy, by being inept, by wanting to please the powers that be. So when you give a lot of independence to a person, you're kind of stuck with whatever happens, unfortunately. So that person who wants to do good, they can do a lot of good. That person doesn't want to cause ripples, well then that person's ineffective. What can you do about a watchdog who doesn't do their job? Well, I am audited once a year by the Auditor General of Ontario, another independent officer of the Legislative Assembly. I report to the Board of Internal Economy of the Legislative Assembly. I report to the Legislative Assembly as a whole. I can be compelled to appear before any of its committees. And once every 5 years, they decide whether I'm going to be reappointed. So those are the mechanisms by which I'm held to account. I'm not sure which body you're referring to. But, and at D&D, I know that there's no such thing as this level of independence that I enjoy in my office. Most oversight bodies there either report to the minister or to another officer of parliament, but there's not much you can do if a watchdog doesn't do their job, except that watchdog loses credibility with both sides. And eventually, as you lose credibility, you lose effectiveness. And it's not just the very aggressive watchdogs that have a hard time getting renewed, it's also the ineffective ones. And we've seen ineffective ones lose their job for being ineffective.
Hello. You're talking about complacency. Is it your sense that people don't act because of laziness or my me is so strong that we don't want to put the effort in? Or more that there's no protection for the people who push us too strongly?
You know, if you're a CEO in Los Angeles and you operate a business in Ottawa and you decide that, okay, it's not profitable, I'm just going to lay everybody off. Bang. You take your red pen and you just close your Ottawa office. Will you lose sleep at night? No. If you have to ride the elevator with the same person every day, the same group of people, and you get to know them, their kids, their family, what they do at night, during weekends, and then you have to make a tough call, will you try to find a way to maybe save those people? You're going to find a more creative way to save money, to make your business more profitable? Of course, because you have a human face at the end of your decision. So the complacency, I think, in government is born out of the fact that they do not realize the human consequence of their decisions. You know, the Family Responsibility Office has been for much of its existence. This is the office in Ontario that enforces child support payments. It has been, for most of its existence, plagued with inefficiency, problems, putting liens on wrong houses. You know, it's been the number one of the top 3 area of complaint in our office since our office was created. Now, if these people realize that if they don't step up to the plate, kids will starve, literally, I think they'd start taking their job more seriously. And so my job, I see very much, is to reverse that. Is to draw attention to government. Hey, there is a consequence here of your action or your inaction, and this is what it is. And that's why our reports are made very personal for that reasons. Ethos, pathos, and logos. Aristotle. Our approach to report writing are based on those 3 principles. You got to be ethical, logical, but appeal to people's humanity to get them to move. And our approach is very much in agreement with Aristotle in how to make the government less complacent and get them to move on these issues.
Hi. I've got 2 questions. One is, does your office investigate specific allegations against individual public servants? And the other is, what's the threshold or criteria for a complaint to sort of become an investigation?
Yes, we do take complaints against public servants. Normally, the complaints are not against personal public servants, they're about their decision-making, about the process. But yes, it can involve an investigation into a direct public servant. The threshold is we accept and investigate virtually everything. We have the discretion not to investigate based on the fact the complainant may be vexatious, have ulterior motives, that kind of thing. The issue is, how is that complaint investigated? And we have 3 levels in our office. We have the early resolution officers, general investigation, and SORT, Special Ombudsman Response Team. Those big reports we're talking about today, they were done by SORT. Not every case goes to that path. We publish 5 or 6 a year of those big cases. They deal with The threshold to us to tackle in a sort is that has to do with a systemic issue, deep-rooted, where an informal approach would not work, where the facts are in dispute, where it's in the public interest. So those are the cases that go to sort. Normally, cases, we try to resolve them at the lowest possible level. If you call and you're waiting for a birth certificate in order to get a passport, in order for you to take a trip, well, that'll be handled summarily. We don't launch a big sort investigation on why John Smith didn't get his passport. That is done low-key, in and out, fast. And that's why we got 37,000 cases. Among them, 5 or 6 become sort cases. Right now, one of the big cases we're working on is Hydro One. Anyone here deal with Hydro One? Okay, count yourself lucky. Hydro One has become a huge, huge issue. It's now the biggest case we've had in our history. We started it with 600 complaints, which was triple the year before, which was 200. And now my latest update today brings it up to 9,500 complaints against Hydro One. And you know what? It doesn't discriminate. We've got complaints from judges, police officers, police chiefs, lawyers, blue-collar workers of all types. They've all been caught up in this vector of Hydro One. And every day, it doesn't abate. Every day I get an update. Oh, we got 10 new cases, 12 new cases, 7 new cases. It just continues to come in. And so what we're doing with Hydro One is we're doing 2 things. We're intervening on an individual basis. So you call in, you say, I got this bill, it's unintelligible. There's no heads or tails to it. We had another bill, my house has been burned down for a year, I'm still getting bills. So we're investigating individually, saying, okay, we'll help you sort through this. And then parallel to that, we're doing a sort investigation. How do we end up in this mess? How do we get out of this mess? How do we prevent further messes? And so expect a formal report in the next few months on Hydro One dealing with systemic issues, but we don't want to keep 10,000 people in the lurch waiting for the big report, so we're helping them individually and tackling the systemic issue at the same time. That's good, I like this. I gave a speech in Hamilton on Saturday and I had one question. What's wrong with this audience?
Hello. You had mentioned that there are other oversight bodies that have quite narrow mandates, quite a tight focus, and I was wondering, you have a very large mandate and a very broad focus, and it's getting broader. How do you train your staff? How do you keep your standards up and kind of organize the work so that you're able to pass judgment on such a broad variety of subject matter?
That's a very good question. I tackle a case, like for example, the lotteries case, right? And I'm saying the complaint is that the retailers are winning disproportionately. And CBC had a big piece on it. They hired a statistician who came out and said, oh, I've studied this and I got 3 PhDs and so on. And this is impossible. They're winning way too many numbers. The OLG, what does it do? It hires a statistician. Oh, no, the other guy doesn't know what he's talking about and so on. And mathematical algorithm and stuff. I got grade 12 math, what do I know? So I walk in there, and what do? Well, might as well hire my own statistician too. So I got to bone up on these extremely complicated areas which I know nothing about overnight and try to sort it out, make some sense out of it. How is that humanely possible? The best analogy I can give you is the role of a jury. A jury, you've got 12 reasonable people who cannot be police officers or lawyers. They know nothing about the law, and they're vetted. So you got 12 people. One's a cab driver, a bus driver, school teacher, nurse, whatever. And at the end of the day, they have to find whether there's complicated fraud took place or a murder took place, or they go through blood splatter evidence, and it's just they're sitting there sometimes for weeks and weeks, sometimes months, and they make a verdict. They come up with a verdict. So my job as ombudsman is to bring to the table common sense and reason, go where the expertise is, and try to make some sense out of it. And, what did I know about newborn screening? I've got 6 kids. I didn't realize that when they were each born, there was a prick of blood taken from one of their toes, and it was tested for all of 2 diseases, but I didn't know they even took blood from a baby when it was born, let alone metabolic disorders with names like long like this. So it's a tough job to stay on top of all of it. We have a great staff. We have the corporate knowledge. You know, I have behind me 40 years of experience. And believe it or not, some of the employees were there 40 years ago. Started as a summer student, they're still there. And combine that with vigorous minds, we've upgraded the skills of our employees. 9 out of 10 new hires in our office are lawyers. Even the EROs, the early response officers who answer the phone and resolve like day-to-day issues, the frontline staff of our office are lawyers, 9 out of 10. Last recruits, I greeted them in our boardroom. They were all EROs, early resolution officers. You know, multiple master's degrees, you know, members of New York Bar, Ontario Bar. I'm sitting around thinking, you know, I'm the least educated one in the room. And so, you know, I surround myself with smarter people, basically. My deputy ombudsman, Barb Finley, is a gold medalist from Ottawa U Law School. So we have incredible talent, and when we put all our minds together, we figure it out. We're extremely cautious with facts. So we fact check. We really make sure. We never want to be open, no, he got the facts wrong. So we want our facts to be unassailable. And I'll tell you another secret of the trade. This is all live tweeted and videotaped and whatever, but it's one of the secrets of the trade is that we look for smoking guns for our SORT investigations. What are cases that you really, you know, beyond the twilight zone? And there are always some of those cases in there. There's always some of these cases. And so that helps to focus on, you know, when I look at a case and I say, all these smart people don't see an issue here. I walk on the scene with fresh eyes and I'm like, what is going on here? And that's really, that's one of the triggers for our systemic investigation. What could possibly be wrong? How come people could have missed this? And that helps as well. Like we don't tackle, you know, pie in the sky issues. You know, how are we going to eradicate child poverty? Because if it was that simple to do, somebody would have thought about it before me. We look at real issues, real problems, where we're struck by the fact that no one's found a solution, and it looks like a no-brainer. That always helps.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ombudsman. I can't help but feel like you're our union rep. You know, like this is essentially our only union that we have remaining. I'm curious, with respect to the legislature, do you have the power to compel the legislature to provide you with a report?
No. And, but we haven't really felt the need to do that. The legislature has been very receptive to our reports. I think it's largely due to the fact that our reports, you know, are colorful, have unassailable facts, reasonable recommendations. You know, when we look at our work, people say, well, what's the key to the success of the office's work? There's no one thing. It's like a chain. It's all these sequence of events, picking the right issues, writing the report in plain language, unassailable facts, recommendations that are reasonable, a investigative process which has integrity and credibility, the credibility of the office. It's all those things together that produce these results. And so I've never felt the need to ask. I don't have the power to begin with, but you know, even in the media to ask the legislature to respond, the government has to respond to our recommendations, and they have. And the legislature has been very supportive of our work. So it's going well. Now, you started your preamble by saying, I'm your only union, and I suspect you meant the public's union. Well, I would like to see that we're there to uphold the public interest. And it clearly states in our legislation that we must be impartial and unbiased. And so, in contrast to a union, which is biased and partial, it takes on issues of the membership. And so that's a big distinction to remember. We won't make everybody happy all the time, and we don't take direction or instructions from anybody, not from government, not from individuals. And that strict impartiality, again, is part of the success of our office. I can pick up the phone and speak to the premier, leaders of the opposition, everybody gets treated the same way. And I think they see that, and that's why we get the respect. We don't get the love. We don't need the love. We get the respect. Yeah, one more question.
Oh.
Then I do have a flight to catch, but I'm happy to entertain one more question.
I feel honored that I have the last question. You've touched many very interesting topics. I just want to focus a little bit more on Bill 8 and municipalities. Should Bill 8 pass, will you be waiting, depending upon complaints from individuals and cities in order to undertake action on municipalities? Or do you see yourself already having some notions of issues that would form the basis for investigations?
So our office enjoys through our statute, not every ombudsman's office has this. We have the own motion power, which means we can instigate investigations when we believe they are necessary. Now, I've taken over 144,000 complaints, I think I've told you, since 2005. I've done that once. The OLG lotteries investigation, I was concerned about what I was seeing in the media, and we decided to investigate. So we do it very, very rarely. Why? Because we have 37 or 27,000 cases a year, so we don't need to make some up. We have enough coming to our platter. So it's not my intention right now, I mean, that might change, but it's not my intention to use the own motion as soon as Bill 8 passes. There's been a tremendous amount of attention towards Bill 8. I think there'll be more as well. There's a lot of people that are chomping at the bit to come to the office of the Ombudsman to complain about their municipality. So I don't think we'll have to make up the work. And because of the limited resources that we have, we will wait for complaints, which will come, I'm convinced, and will not launch an own motion. At least that's my inclination right now. Well, you've been a great audience. Thank you so much. It's been lots of fun.